for a treat. We have a great presentation here for you today. It's called Transforming Reader Identity, Positive Approaches to Literacy for Older Readers. And there's just a few housekeeping tips I want to give you before we get started. First, I do want to tell everyone that you will receive a follow-up email after the webinar, and it will include your certificate of attendance and a copy of the slides. So you'll have a reference after the presentation. You'll also get a link to the recording so you can watch this again later at your leisure or share it with colleagues. And I'd like to point out the question box on your control panel. You can use that question box if you're having a problem with anything. One of us will try to help you, but also put your questions there for our presenter. And toward the end of the presentation, we will present those to Dr. D Hart, and he can answer those for us. So with that, I'd like to also point out that we are live on social media, and we would love to have you follow us. If you go to Twitter, Facebook, next slide, please, Jason. Thank you. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And on those platforms, you'll find great information about future webinars, podcasts, and blogs. So make sure you give us a follow. Next slide. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason D Hart, who is a teacher at Wilkes Central High School in North Carolina. He was previously an assistant professor of reading education at Appalachian State University. He has a long history in education, and he's a researcher and writer. His research topics are multimodal literacy, including film and graphic novels, literacy instruction with adolescents, and he has taught middle grades for years, so he knows what he's talking about in today's presentation. So with that, Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it from here.
All right, thank you so much. That may be the best picture of me that exists. So I'm glad that I could share it with you. I wanted to do a sort of like camera comes on and I come rushing in, but I stayed on camera. So great to sort of see everybody out there, and thanks for joining us to talk about adolescent literacy. And thanks to those of you that might be watching the recording, maybe freezing the video later on for whatever silly face I might happen to make or anything like that. So as Jean said, my name is Jason D Hart. I have a PhD in literacy. I taught middle grades for 8 years. And this is a little bit about my background, my educational journey, just to sort of situate who I am and just kind of share a little bit about my experiences, because it's always nice to hear from someone, I think, that has been there, is in the classroom. I'm currently in the classroom. Actually, I'm currently in a room in my home, but I was in the classroom earlier today giving an EOC. What's more teacherly than that? And so always glad to share about my rubber meets the road experiences of the things that I think about theoretically and in terms of research, but also what actually works and how things shape up in the classroom. My original track at Lee University was to be a pastor, and sort of found my ministry in the classroom. I spent 8 years at a school called Ocoee Middle in Cleveland, Tennessee, and taught middle grades, 8th grade language arts there. And then I pursued my doctorate at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and currently working at Wilkes Central. So it's been a good journey, and I did spend the past 3 years at Appalachian State. So wonderful to step back into the classroom. I don't have an Appalachian State logo up here, but I did dress like their Mountaineer emblem today. I sort of have the yellow that I think one of their mascots wears, so hopefully representing them in some way as well. So with that being said, we will get right down to it and talk for the next 45 minutes or so about adolescent literacy, some of the questions, some of the thoughts that have come to my mind over the years, certainly stepping into the classroom with an MAT, stepping in without a background in education, working on my master's degree as a first-year tired teacher, and now stepping back into the classroom and teaching high school literacy as well. So my essential question, my guiding question, because those are always nice to have in a lesson or in a talk, is what do I do when I have an older reader who is striving? I know that language around readers who are struggling has been in some transition over the past few years. When I first started teaching in 2007, it was not uncommon to hear someone say struggling reader, but I know that we move the reader first, centering who they are as a person and as a reader. I do believe that all of my students are readers, and that language of striving. So what do I do when I have a student who has spent a considerable amount of their living time, their human life, in a classroom, having a teacher sort of throw books at them, invite them to literacy experiences, and they're striving, and it almost seems like they're in maybe a boat where they're continuing to scoop water out. And each year there are more standards, more tests, more ERCs, more of the things that we have to do as educators, and more of the things that we're required to teach. So sometimes educators like me get stressed, and sometimes we're looking for that best answer. What do I do when students are still striving? And you'll notice the DeLorean image here, because a lot of times I've been to talks where the answer seems to be, well, you intervene early. And I completely agree with that. I don't know an educator that would disagree with early intervention. I know that Marie Clay has a wonderful statement about early intervention and research that's been done in early grades. First grade would be ideal. But the students that I work with are not necessarily first graders. They are well beyond first grade and have been for the majority of my career. And so apart from a machine like the DeLorean, apart from a time machine that would allow us to go back to first grade, which would be nice for a variety of reasons, we really need some more complex answers than early intervention. Certainly early in the school year, absolutely, with block schedules, the amazing amount of work that we all have to do, and the way that a school year goes so fast. Certainly we want to get to know students as quickly as possible, but that early intervention answer also can be expanded, I think, to think about students that have been spending a good bit of their lives looking at interventions of different kinds, and maybe not receiving some of the support that maybe they could have. And so there are a couple of steps here that I try to keep in mind, not just when I'm writing about what happens in the classroom, but when I'm actually in the classroom. And the first of those is the way that I talk about students, the way that I think about students, even the way that I think about myself. We're certainly all human, and we bring our humanity to the classroom, insecurities and all. And so thinking about myself as a reader, thinking about the experiences that I've had, both positive and negative in school experiences, but then also thinking about, okay, what does this student who is on the other side of the desk, so to speak, what are they thinking about themselves? When they get my name on their schedule with a course, what are they thinking this is going to be like? Or do they have immediate feelings of excitement and glee when they see the word reading, or they know that English is related to reading, or they see AP composition? Probably not, probably not. Very often, the students that I work with almost immediately self-identify and say, I don't like to read. And one of the reasons why I know that is because among their name and hobbies and interests, one of the first things that I ask them, just out of curiosity really, is what are the things that you like to read? And so students that very much like to self-identify with that notion of I don't like to read will immediately offer that up. I've even had a student tell me first or second day of class, Dr. D Hart, you're not going to like me very much. And the conversation goes, well, why? Well, I just don't like English. And I'm going, but I'm a person here. We have more in common than just a schedule and a class. And so thinking about not labeling, but understanding students who are striving, students who are thriving, and you have three images here that sort of represent the way that I think about this, along with a nod to the book, From Striving to Thriving. And so the first image here you might recognize from Greek mythology, one of the things that I loved as a kid and continue to love to talk about in the language arts classroom. Sisyphus rolling the mountain, rolling the stone up and down the mountain. It seems like every day starting at the same task over and over again. And I don't know about you, but I found myself in this place as a teacher of trying the same approach with the same content multiple times, really jumping back and trying that novel one more time and trying that approach. And sometimes I feel like students might see themselves in that position of sort of rolling the stone up the hill and looking for that breakthrough moment, or at least maybe a place to put the stone other than in their hands. And so the second image here, we have the budding image of a plant. I don't know what sort of plant this is, but I thought it looked lovely when I was searching through Google Images. The budding idea of almost there, not quite there, or maybe there's some real life going on here, but there are some parts that aren't quite fully developed yet of literacy. And then the final image here is a shout out imagistically to Kylene Beers, whose work has really inspired me over the years. And Kylene Beers talks about the identity of the reader who's striving, and essentially says that striving readers, or readers who are striving, are incredibly brave human beings. And so this is something that I do. I pause, I try to keep in mind when I'm looking at graphs, when I'm looking at information, when I'm looking at EOC scores, and thinking about the fact that the students that I work with, if they're students who are striving, spend a considerable amount of their lives in a place where they know every day they're going to be asked to read. They don't like to read. They don't necessarily like to read, and they certainly don't want to read out loud. And so thinking about myself, what would it be like for me to go to a place where someone were to ask me to do something that I'm not comfortable doing for multiple hours a day? I think that being a ballerina dancer, that would be very uncomfortable for me. And so that's sort of an image that comes to mind when I start thinking about, and I guess empathizing with, in a way, the reader who's striving, the student in my classroom who sees English and doesn't immediately make that connection. Side note, for me, that connection isn't made with words like algebra and geometry. And so I always appreciated teachers who really dove into math and made it more understandable and engaging. The second thing that I think about is recognizing both the social and the emotional and the complex lives that students lead, not just in terms of thinking about the day-to-day activities that students have to deal with in terms of negotiating relationships with their peers, negotiating relationships with family members, negotiating grief, but those larger things that we know about that are part of society. That P word that we've been using for the past 3 years, the pandemic, I still cannot watch a TV show or read a book that has the word pandemic as part of the plot summary. I'm just not there yet. And so it's difficult for me to even imagine what my students are thinking. Some of them may have lost loved ones. Some of them have experienced COVID multiple times and had multiple impacts from COVID. And certainly we know the dynamic of difference that's occurred for students that have been online for a considerable amount of time. I was talking about this with a colleague today, talking about trying to sign onto computers, the immediate shift to computer-based learning. And although I love digital literacy, being thrust into a digital learning environment obviously was not the best thing for anyone. It was necessitated by public health. And then thinking about trying to get students online if they did have a computer. So there's all of that, not to mention sort of the conflicts that are part of our social, emotional, and political landscape, and some of the ways that students negotiate those realities. And then on top of that, you can see sort of the effect of the Sunday stacking up here. You also have, again, this idea that, oh, I'm not very good at this thing that this guy with this beard is asking me to do all day long, all day long. And so just thinking about these multiple factors that students are facing, have faced, puts me in that position of thinking about ways that I can maybe make literacy a little more palatable. So one of the ways that I do that, and I think about that, is beginning with a framework for success. This could be as simple as starting the day and not thinking about all the things that I haven't done yet. I'm a big to-do list kind of person. And so sometimes when I'm looking at curricular standards, I make those out like a to-do list, as in I have to accomplish some conversation or some engagement with all of these standards in the time that I'm allotted with students. And that can feel very, very overwhelming. It's very overwhelming at times. but instead thinking about, well, these are the things that I know that my students have a grasp on. These are the areas where I know the building blocks are there. And there are things that my students bring with them. There are those strengths that my students bring with them. And then thinking about, okay, how do I take these parts of our experience together, these moments of success, and then build on that and build on that. And I've heard it said that part of what we're after in terms of reading and writing is more reading, more writing. But I would also add to that and say there's a precision, there's a specificity that comes with that. Yes, I'm after more reading. I want my students to read more, but I'm not just sort of, you know, those baseball machines that'll just throw balls at you all day. If you put me in front of one of those, I would probably sink into a pile on the ground. That's not the role that I play. I'm not just checking books at people all day. Instead, I'm thinking about ways that I can get students to read more, but to do that in a way that also has me come alongside them, that has me reading aloud with them, that has me modeling practice. And so it's not just about more, but it's about more with a particular purpose, maybe a particular approach. And when my students have had enough of a particular approach, recognizing that I can step away, pivot, and work on maybe some other areas where we can build strength as a class. And you'll notice the references that are here to Frankel and Hall, helping students see themselves as readers and writers. Identity is one of those factors that's part of intervention and part of working with students. That is absolutely essential. Thinking of the older reader, which we'll talk more about those facets and components, but thinking about the essence of who we are, who we know ourselves to be, and who we are coming to know ourselves to be. And if curriculum doesn't reflect that, then my goodness, there's so many other things that I would be more interested in as a young reader of the world that do reflect my avocations, my interests, my personality. I mean, TikTok is a constant stream. It's a ticker tape of ideas just flashing by on the screen. So in some ways, curriculum, in some ways, approaches have to meet our students where they are, and they have to reflect who our students are and who our students understand themselves to be and who they want to be in the world. It's a curriculum of vision, envisioning ourselves in the world. And so naming those areas of strength is part of this work, getting more and more activity around reading and writing is part of this, but also supporting scaffolding. And there's a real art to that. And my proviso, I guess you could say. My motto here is that I am still learning how to do this. I've taught for a while, I earned a PhD, but there's a theoretical world of how all of this works. And one of the points that I want to make clearly throughout this presentation is just a love note to teachers saying, this is difficult work. And just when you feel like you found the just right answer, there's another day that comes along, there's another set of challenges that comes. And so this is really, really difficult work. And I think just acknowledging that and recognizing that every day it's an artful approach based in science is absolutely essential. I think to our emotional health, our survival, and the place that we have to be in of helping students refill their cups. So speaking of refilling and filling cups, when I think about the ways that our students bring strength with them to a classroom, I think about my principal, the first principal that I worked for. His name was Ron Spangler. He just passed away a few months ago, and very important person in my life because, among other things, he was the first person to give me a teaching job, and that's a big deal. That is a big deal. And so I remember one of the things that he said to me. We were looking at growth scores, and I might have just shared a swear word on this recorded session of growth scores and EVOS. I was teaching in Tennessee at the time, so it was TVOS. And he was talking about this metaphor of a half empty cup, a cup with some water in it, and thinking about what students are bringing with them. And so I thought about this metaphor a lot over the years. And I love my principal, but I'm going to change this metaphor just a little bit because I feel like one of the things that I have to remind myself about is that regardless of what a check-in says, regardless of what a score says, my students have a cup that is full of experiences, of opinions, certainly, of thoughts about the world, thoughts about themselves. All of my students have full cups already. So this is not a glass half empty mentality. All of my students have something to bring to the classroom. At the same time, there are these things that I'm trying to add to my students' experiences. I'm trying to do this very difficult work of thinking about the things that I can share and sharing them in a way that is attractive, that's interesting, that's engaging, I dare say entertaining, which can be tiring all its own. And I'm trying to negotiate all of that without coming off as though I'm taking something and trying to pour it in. It's more of a communal flood, I think, than me sort of taking a cup and walking around and dousing people with it. That's at least the way that I'm trying to think about it, and thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy, thinking about the diversity, the strengths, all of the experiences that my students bring, all of the knowledge that they bring that I don't necessarily have. And it really repositions that idea of I have to be the expert at everything. Now, I do want my students to hear me read, and I do want to be involved in my students' writing, and I want to be involved in helping my students think about maybe the best use of time in terms of what to do with the text. But I'm certainly not the expert on everything. And so recognizing that gives me permission to say, I don't know, which is a wonderful place to be in as a teacher, because I still haven't learned everything. I turned 40 this year, and I'm sure that as a 16-year-old high school student, I thought that at 40 I would know everything. But I'm starting to think that if I live to see 80, I'm still not going to know everything. And by that point, I'll probably be forgetting a lot of things. So the cup will be spilling water all the time. The other thing that this metaphor makes me think about are students who have that 99th percentile, who on a test, their data indicate that they have this maximum understanding of everything. And this is just one of those limitations of data, because again, there are these experiences that we can all have around literacy, around reading and writing in a classroom. So if this was a full cup and I have a student who is operating at the 99th percentile, then it's almost like me trying to carry a cup from one side of the room to the other without spilling something along the way. It's not going to happen. I'm going to spill something. And so thinking about this metaphor, not just as, oh, I'm feeling something into this empty space, but thinking about this metaphor as my students are bringing something, I'm bringing something, and we're collaborating on this. And I've planned for it, I've thought about it, I've done the good teacher things and done my homework. But I also recognize that good lessons very often change, and very often by the end of the lesson, there might be a different direction that we go, or there might be something that my students have brought that I hadn't thought about. And this is all just part of that noticing and naming strength. And linking back to Frankel's piece about what's so important in the interventions that we have students engaged with, there's this quote that I love, which is that we cannot ignore the assets that students bring. Centering, valuing their voice is part of this. And so what is in English language arts class, what is a literacy experience other than a way to quote William Nicholson, the playwright behind the story of C.S. Lewis' Shadowlands, to know we're not alone in the world. In some ways, I want healing to be part of what we work with in reading. I want experiences to be part of what we work with in reading. I want a reflection to be part of that, but I also want to learn about the experiences that have gathered in the room. I will certainly share about my own experiences as much as feels appropriate to me professionally and in the moment, but I also don't want to be the only voice, the only talking head in the room. You might not recognize that because I'm currently doing a Zoom webinar, but I absolutely don't want to be the only voice in the room in a classroom experience. Not only will that be exhausting if I'm doing that all day, every day, but I also need to learn something about my students. And I need to learn first, I think, if I'm going to guide students in a learning process. I don't want to ask students to go to a place that I'm not willing to go to engage in a process that I've not engaged in for myself. And thinking about reading, if I've not gone to that process, if I've not thought about my thinking and been metacognitive and thought about the ways that I engage with texts and made that visible, then I'm making the work harder for myself and for everybody else. And so there's more to this than just something I think that sounds like a nice statement. I think there's really something connected for the classroom. And so thinking about those connections, that social and cultural awareness, imagine one of these spokes is you. You can pick the one, you can point to it, you can write your name on it. You can imagine one of these other spokes might be a particular student that you have in mind. Sometimes I think a classroom can feel like that one spoke and the other spoke sort of in opposition to each other. And some days this dynamic plays out well, and some days it doesn't play out as well. Some days we're well caffeinated, patient. Other days we're less caffeinated. There's more going on. There's been a fire drill in the middle of our perfect lesson. All of those things are part of this reality. But when I'm thinking about a classroom, I'm also thinking about the multiple other spokes. And so certainly you could think about students in the room. Students in the room and the ways that we group students, the ways we think about grouping students, that's all part of this. But what are the other voices in this classroom? And if you want to chat in, I know I've been talking for a while, it would be a wonderful opportunity to join the chat box and just tell me who do you think some of these other pieces on this colorful spoke might be. If there's anything in the chat box, Caitlin or Jean, you're welcome to shout it out. I'm going to name mentors, people that might not necessarily be in the room, but whose voices are part of that experience. I'm going to name other teachers that I've collaborated with, because this is not solos and silos. It's certainly work that's connected. Anybody have another one? Anybody out there? Thinking about literacy, thinking about reading and writing.
I'm seeing a lot about teachers, parents, family members,
Absolutely.
colleagues, cultural influences, communities, administrators that may have made a difference or not.
Absolutely. All part of this. I'm also thinking about those literary voices that we bring with us from the past, from the present, and I do try to diversify curriculum and bring in voices from the past and voices from the present. So there's so many voices that are part of this. Administrators, and several of you shouted out folks that I hadn't even necessarily thought about, but administrators that have made that positive impact or less positive, families that are certainly part of this and that we want to be part of this, community resources, absolutely. And thinking about how do I walk into a classroom and share my one experience, that's not what this is about. This is about connecting experiences throughout. That's part of, I think, ultimately why we want to read and write in the first place, even as young people, to capture a picture that we love, to capture an idea that we want to share with someone. And so there's absolutely that opportunity for engagement and getting to experience maybe something that we're just not fully aware of yet in the classroom. So in terms of literacy, I know that the term balanced literacy is not necessarily the best term to use in all cases at all times. It has to be really clearly defined. And I love the blended approach, the blended idea of literacy is this multitude of processes. Reading is such a complex process. As students are growing older, the other thing that I recognize is that students are experiencing a remarkable range of complexity as well in the world around them, in the ways that they're thinking about the world around them. And so the first notice here that you'll see is Paulo Freire, this idea that older readers need both the word and the world. They are readers of the word and the world, and that's part of literacy too. I really like the idea of my students identifying as readers and recognizing the reading that they probably already are doing. The reading processes that they're engaged with just to navigate social media or to navigate the resources that are available to them, to join a Zoom class, to engage with something that they're interested in. It doesn't stop there. It's not about stopping at social media or stopping at only the things that we're interested in, but that's certainly part of the equation. And that's certainly part of the process of recognizing that, yeah, we do read. We read the world around us. We also read words. And then this intentional use of close instruction with language features. I love the idea, and Jean mentioned in my bio that I work with comics and graphic novels a lot, which I absolutely love as story archetypes and as a text to share with students in the classroom. But I also really love the idea of the printed or digital word. And I love that teaching reading always involves looking at the word. There are absolutely pictures in some texts that come alongside, but a really focused approach in terms of reading will absolutely include close attention to vocabulary, close attention to the kind of specific terms that you can find in a variety of texts, and just thinking about the really, really amazing vocabulary that can be discovered in a variety of texts. So the question on the slide is, do older students sometimes need additional attention when it comes to word families, vowel and consonant patterns? Yes, they absolutely do. Close attention, systematic attention to the ways that words work. I mean, I'm not sure how I would teach vocabulary instruction without that, without looking at those building blocks of words, without looking at word parts and ways to build new words. It's something that is simply part of our language. And it seems like a drastic overstatement or understatement, but we can't teach reading without reading. We can't teach decoding words without looking at words. And so there's absolutely that part of the kinds of text that I bring to the classroom. And I want to bring a wide variety of text to the classroom. But I also don't stop at a particular type of text. I want my students to read a lot. But again, it's not just about reading more and more. It's about those specific steps that we can take, those specific actions and decisions that we can make as educators to help students get exposed to the next text and the next text that increases complexity. And sometimes my decision-making process about text that I share has a lot to do with the time that I can devote to sort of demonstrating how to walk through a text. I'm not going to necessarily hand something over, again, thinking about that baseball metaphor of always checking the ball. If my students need a lot of support with it, if a lot of my students need a lot of support with the text, it's something that we'll do together. Absolutely. And I want my students to also engage with text with me by their side that are very complex, that are very challenging, but to do that in a way that they know that I'm alongside them and that I'm helping them. And do they reach a point where they don't want to look at the same text again through a fourth reread? Absolutely. And that's where there are these ranges of text that we can bring into a classroom to help our students really experience the full breadth of reading. So thinking about ways to frame literacy, does this mean that students need to look at individual words? Yes. Does this mean that students need to look at the ways that words appear on the page? Yes. Does this mean that students need to read a lot? Absolutely. This also means that there are new media, there are new ways of looking at text and thinking about text. I'm not going to get all of those experiences through exposure to those media in particular, but it's a yes and. Students benefit from thinking about how they encounter text in the changing world, thinking about those processes, thinking about those pieces, but also connecting the written, connecting the spoken and connecting what they're reading to the ideas that are present in the world around them at the moment. It's more of an ongoing conversation than necessarily just a repetition of looking at the same kinds of texts. And so thinking about the role that authentic texts play, thinking about absolutely choice and interest for students, there are those parts of engagement that those approaches offer, but there are also those specific steps that I can take as a teacher to think about, okay, what makes sense next for my students? What makes sense next? Now that we've looked at this word, now that we've found this pattern of words, what is going to make the most sense? And a lot of times that's related to the students, their goals, thinking about what it is that they see connected to their experiences in the world around them too, and the way that I can approach that. And that's a lot of personal work. It's a lot of getting to know students in a very quick amount of time and sharing part of my love of literacy through texts that I love, but also getting to know my students enough that I can bring in texts that they love or will fall in love with as well. So thinking about that specific systematic instruction, it's a part to whole. It's a part to whole sort of process. And if you've looked at the reading models from Erie, thinking about those basic components to more complex components to even more complex components. Language works this way, thinking about the individual parts of words, the way that I can connect to longer words, the way that I can connect to more syntactic variety, simple sentences to complex sentences. And again, thinking back to that image of the cup. What are those things that my students have already mastered? Where is it that they are coming from? What are they bringing to the classroom? And then, maybe they've got those kernels that are right there on the table, or maybe they've got a complete half here, or maybe they have a whole. And so thinking about more reading and writing, but specifically, intentionally with what's the more that makes most sense for you as a reader, as a learner? What is going to be the thing that I can help you do as a teacher that will help you step into that next part of the process and next beyond that? And thinking about ways to support readers through that process. It's a lot of work, and thank goodness for curriculum that exists. Thank goodness for programs that exist. Thank goodness for support among colleagues that exists, because again, it's really not easy work. And as much as I would love to have the time to devote to write my own program or curriculum, using some of those materials in thoughtful and intentional ways is also an extremely, extremely helpful set of resources to draw on, because I simply don't have enough time in a working day to do all of those things. It's really complicated work that we all do. And so I don't know if that's a good opportunity for you to give yourself a reward out there, but absolutely celebrating that complexity. Again, thinking about how do I make this simple, and think about what my students have already, where they are, and also the steps that they take from there. Sometimes when I'm looking at that list of standards and I'm looking at those objectives, it can feel like an insurmountable task, thinking again of moving the stone up the hill as I work my way through the standards, but also recognizing that ultimately I do want to meet students where they are in terms of reading and writing and the steps that make the most sense for them in terms of their needs. So what is the role of speaking, listening, and engaging for students who are older? When I was in school, one of the things that I remember vividly was having a lot of time to read individually on my own. And I remember reading had a lot to do with answering questions at the end of chapters. I remember that in almost every content area. And I feel like I had really strong teachers, but reading was sort of approached in that way, especially by the time I got to secondary education. By the time I was an adolescent, I was expected to take things home, read them, answer questions. And reading has been talked about in this way by Jeffrey Wilhelm, of this process of reading just to answer questions. And so thinking about, maybe there is a chance for me to engage in classroom discussion and dialogue. I know that with intentional questions, I can model a lot for students. Sometimes my voice begins to sort of settle into the background. And so asking a student what they were thinking when we were reading something, what they were picturing as we were reading something, particularly that student that may be able to sketch it out verbally or visually. Thinking about the ways that talk can also support this incredibly complex and invisible process. And also thinking about the students that may not be ready to write down everything that they're thinking for me. Sometimes students tend to sort of with emotional processes that they're working through, and some of the shame that surrounds reading and reading later on in school and reading needs. Sometimes students don't necessarily want to show that maybe they have some growth to work on in a particular area. But I can engage with the conversation and I can see where students are in a particular way. And maybe that book report becomes something that is initially spoken or initially videoed with some notes or something, or some images that go along with it. But maybe I'm also thinking about that next step in terms of how do I get students to talk to me about what they're thinking with reading and responding with reading in a way that builds on. And it doesn't stop at just speaking, it doesn't just stop at listening, but it's that fuller, more rounded engagement piece, so that I know that when I've read something, there's that purpose that has been set. And I can be very guilty, and you can probably chat the name of your favorite book right now that you know you want to teach it because you love it. And it stings when you have a student that doesn't love it too. For me, that was the Hunger Games. I loved teaching the Hunger Games in middle school. And I almost always had at least one student that it just wasn't quite their book. It just wasn't quite their book. And I went with that and loved them anyway and tried to get them to really love it as much as I did. But maybe it's about more than just the book that I like in that particular moment. And maybe it's more about those particular skills, that love of reading along with those mechanics of literacy is absolutely, it's part of that blend that I'm thinking about. So along with that idea of writing, composing, speaking, I'm thinking about the ways that, again, being a comics and graphic novel person, maybe responses from students also incorporate images and also incorporate the artistic. And that way, I mean, if you're thinking about visualizing as a skill for reading, there's absolutely that component. I can't step into the mind of a child and see what they're seeing as they read. And I'm really glad that I can't. I'm really glad that I can't. I'm glad that's not my superpower. However, it would be helpful at times to sort of know the neural pathway and to know some of those pieces that are connecting and are not necessarily connecting. But if I can ask a student to draw something, if I can ask them to respond visually, again, not stopping at the visual, always connecting in some way to the verbal, I sort of have a portrait of them, a portrait of what they're seeing and a portrait of what they're experiencing. And I can do this with think alouds as well to share what I'm visualizing and thinking about, but it's, I think, a key step. And again, a type of text that is not the only text that I'm going to use. I think sometimes we get really caught in this dynamic of this side of the argument or that side of the argument. But it's more, again, something that's blended and something that I can draw on as a tool. And it's not my entire curriculum. It's not my entire program, but it is something that I can use in a particular moment in a class to help me understand a student just a little bit better. So as we're coming down to our last few minutes of idea sharing, I would love to hear some questions from all of you in just a few minutes. I'm going to hit some final points here. I know that I've said a lot. I hope that I've said some things that connect with you from experiences that I've had and from things that I'm still thinking about and I'm still working on. Just thinking about those plugged in experiences, Again, I gave an EOC this morning on a computer, and so plugins in some of our classrooms are at premium, let me tell you. But thinking about the ways that I can get students plugged in to a class, plugged into a literacy experience. There's not one particular way, I don't think, but thinking about those classroom experiences, those things that we all share. Classrooms build cultures really, really quickly. Inside jokes become inside jokes really, really quickly. So just approaching the classroom from that human perspective, absolutely. First, thinking about the interactions I have with students and the ways that I communicate care and value to them. Thinking about the authors that I highlight is part of this as well. Moving to authentic texts and thinking about texts that aren't necessarily just the ones that I see over and over again, but maybe some new authors. Anybody else have students that are really into Colleen Hoover right now? Colleen Hoover is rocking reading life for some students. Thinking about those texts that I bring in, the themes that I can connect to in terms of healing and working with students, and then making the time once more to ensure that I've heard from students, heard their voices, and connected this idea of literacy, not just to what I can answer on a test, but the opportunity to actually shape the world around me, to take my understanding of the word and the world and to share it in some way. And so I always plan way too much, but thinking about making materials accessible, thinking about those ways that I can get books into students' hands, that's absolutely the work to do. On this wordy slide, the thing that I want to point out most, I think, other than love for my mentors, is this is just never done. It is both a science, it's an art, and we need to celebrate a lot. And teachers are vital in all of this. There is no replacement for a really thoughtful teacher, the teacher that speaks into our lives, and stepping back into the classroom after 3 years at Appalachian State and 7 years in higher education. Again, I wish that I could just step in and sort of know everything, but it's absolutely this difficult process, challenging process, absolutely rewarding at the same time. And so the work that we do isn't celebrated enough, I think, and the work that you do is not celebrated enough. And so just sharing out that heartbeat of care for the classroom and the absolutely life-changing work and literacy transforming work that you all do. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jean for any Q&A that has dropped into the chat box. And as I've demonstrated for the last 45 minutes, I'm also glad to continue talking.
Thank you, Jason. That was great, and some really good applicable information. So we appreciate it, and I know our attendees today do too. We have some good questions for you here. We have a few minutes. To our listeners, if you want to ask Dr. D Hart a question, go ahead and put it into the question field. You still have time, but let's get started. Here's a good one. Jason, how do you help a student who mispronounces or uses the wrong word, but the context is not altered?
Oh, yeah, I love that. So I'm getting, again, thinking through a strengths-based mindset of thinking about the context and how a student's using the context. So kudos to that student for thinking about the context in itself. But I mean, tricky words like that, English words can be quite tricky, and we have those commonly confused words in the language. And for that, I'm thinking about exposure, ways that I use those words in the classroom, ways that I can point out those differences between the ways that we use words. And sometimes that can even be socially constructed, a situation-based kind of thing. But thinking about the pronunciation there, again, I would give the student at least credit for using the context and thinking about the context, but also talking about the ways we can use language across contexts and how that changes meaning, I think is a really, really good discussion. And one that students, I mean, they'll use that in life as well, thinking about the context in which you might find yourself.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's another one. First of all, and this is in her words, thank you so much for framing the students we support as, quote, striving readers. I love this, and I'm going to start spreading it around my organization. So no
Oh,
question built in
great.
there, but just a thank you. Okay, so here's one. I hope this one isn't like a whole new uh, webinar in itself. It looks really good and meaty. For high school students still working on decoding skills, what is the most appropriate way to balance this instruction with CCSS while also keeping in mind students' needs and identities?
Yeah, and oh my goodness, I work with students that represent the parts of that question um, every day. So one of the things that I really appreciate is the opportunity I can have with students to share a text that may be text only. So sometimes I find something that's more simplified text that still has meaning, uh, but it might be part of like a curriculum that, oh my goodness, it's either something that I've created if I've had the time, or it's maybe part of a curriculum that's actually for younger students. I was working with a student once who was in 8th grade and made the mistake of handing over a workbook that had grade 1 on the cover. The student was working toward bilingualism, and that was a very quick kind of kick me sort of moment. So working with text only copies, I think, is really helpful. Modeling that practice for any student, the student that's still working on decoding, the student that has decoding but is working on fluency or comprehension. Modeling is hands down one of the best things that you can do. But then also thinking about, again, a text that I can build some comprehension around. I think sometimes texts that get handed to students, like they don't necessarily have that context that we heard about in the last question. And so giving a text that does have some words to work on, but still has meaning that a student can connect to so that they can see, okay, this has a real purpose for me reading it. And then always, always, even if it's just a word, even if it's a sentence, giving a student the chance to respond in writing, creating a response. And I don't always necessarily look at spelling or grammar in a written response. I'm after students responding in some way to what we've read, and it's more about that interaction that I mentioned than maybe another opportunity to correct grammar or spelling. Although those are things that we'll work on. And although if I see frequent misspellings, I'll make sure that those words are in a lot of things that we work on in context. Those would be some of my thoughts about approaching that student. And again,
Okay,
there are
great.
other things that might be added to it, but just a few steps there. And back to the thank you from the person. I would love to take credit for talking about readers who are striving, but that was Stephanie Harvey, I believe is the person, Harvey and Ward in from Striving to Thriving. So would love to take credit on that one, but just an idea that has meant a lot to me from someone else.
That's great. That's great. Here's a really good one. How do you get students to be more confident in trying to pronounce words?
Yeah, definitely not whole group, right? Definitely not asking them to pronounce words in the whole group. Thinking more about one-on-one work that you can do, working with words over and over again that you can do based on context there again. Um, and I am also not opposed to recognizing when a student has had that moment of success and giving them the chance to show it. Sometimes one of the most vulnerable moments in my classroom was the moment when a principal would come to observe. And in those moments, so adapting a practice from that, I would be walking around looking at what students were doing, looking at what students were writing. And for particular classes, I would always sort of keep in mind they might not necessarily want to share what they've written down because they know that my principal's in here or some other person, or it's just a different kind of day. And so sort of vetting the responses and giving the chance to say, hey, that's a really good one. You should definitely say that. You'll love it. It creates that opportunity. So it's a risk anytime a student steps out and shares something. in a classroom, but it's less of a risk and it's more of a supported risk if it's been vetted, if students have interacted with us around it just a little bit. Flashing back to some really bad round robin reading experiences for myself here when I would mispronounce words that I had practiced over and over again. So anyway.
That's great. Here's a good one from an administrator. How do I support the teachers as I ask those teachers in all content areas to support reading instruction?
Yeah, I think, I mean, recognizing, I've talked with teachers in, let's say, social studies, and they talk about their 80 standards, that they're always on the rush to cover whatever covering a standard means, you know, working through mastery on all of their standards. Recognizing that folks are busy already as part of that and acknowledging that. But then also, I think sometimes reading and writing get put in as this additional thing. And it feels like I'm doing these 10 things already. Now you're telling me I'm a teacher of reading as well. So there's another thing I got to do. And, you know, there's another checklist on my chart that I have to hang on the wall or on my rubric. I think instead of that approach, were I an administrator, which I don't want to be, I don't think I would make it as much a checklist item as I would say, you know, this is part of what you're already doing. And when we talk about writing instruction, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are taking multiple days in your class that's already packed content to write a full essay. Maybe it's a short response. Maybe it's talking to the English teacher or the English department and making sure that you connect maybe those stems between you and the health teacher. Maybe some of those things that already exist that can actually be used to support what teachers are already doing. I think is part of that equation. Ironically, I would say that the best place that I learned how to write essays was in AP history. It wasn't even in an English class. And so I think recognizing the work that teachers are doing and also just noting that reading and writing are fundamental steps that will just help them get work done in a thoughtful way, in a deep way, and maybe in the way that some teachers have been sort of working on already.
Sounds good. Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions. If we could go to the next slide, Jason.
Absolutely.
We want to tell our attendees about Language Live, which is Voyager Sopris Learning's adolescent reading intervention program. You can find out more about Language Live at voyagersopris.com/language live. It's blended literacy for grades 5 through 12 and focuses on foundational advanced reading skills to help all adolescents become proficient readers. So learn more about that on our website. On the next slide, if you would, we'd like to tell you about our next webinar, which is coming up on Valentine's Day. Dr. Anita Archer, many of you know her and her work. She's the author of Rewards, and she'll be presenting a webinar called The Human Heart Characteristics of Teachers. This is a really good, feel-good, motivational webinar about what makes teachers teachers. And she'll be sharing tips and personal stories of teachers she's known throughout her multi-decade career. So make sure you register for that at voyagersopris.com/webinars. And with that, we'll go to the next slide. And we just want to say thank you, first of all, to Dr. Jason D Hart for sharing his expertise today. This has been a wonderful hour that we've spent with you. We've learned so much, and we really appreciate your time. And as I said, sharing with all our attendees your expertise. To everyone who joined us today in the audience, thank you for your time. Also, watch for that email that will be coming to you from Voyager Sopris with the link to the recording, a copy of the slides, and your certificate of attendance. Please go to voyagersopris.com/webinars and look at EdView 360 and see our archived of great webinars and future webinars and podcasts to come. With that, we're going to sign off for today. Dr. D Hart, thank you again, and thanks everyone. Have a great evening.
So much.